Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Les Lenkowski, and I bring you wishes from the director of the Tocqueville program, my colleague Aurelian Crayutu, who I believe is somewhere on the East Coast or something like that. Hopefully it's warmer, but anyway. And hopefully the parking is better than it's around here. So I apologize for getting started just a few minutes late. I worked with Aurelian in recruiting speakers here and developing the Tocqueville program. So I'll take over the moderating duties today, and I'm also going to be commenting a little. I want to thank you all for coming. This is one of the stronger turnouts we've had, so we're grateful for that as well. We have with us today the author of this book. Signed copies are available at the book corner if you'd like to purchase one. Alvin Felzenberg, the title of the book, A Man and His Presidents, The Political Odyssey of William F. Buckley Jr. And it is a terrific read. The basic material, besides Bill Buckley's own writings, which were voluminous, is a huge archive of his correspondence and similar items that's at Yale University. And Buckley was a very faithful keeper of that archive throughout his entire career, correspondence with people he met, reports on meetings he had, all sorts of things. And Al has spent the last 7 years combing through this and telling a fascinating story, odyssey in two sense, a personal odyssey of William F. Buckley Jr., but also the odyssey of the idea of the political idea of conservatism in American society, where the two overlap and especially come together during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Al himself has worked in government, starting off by serving in the administration of Tom Paine when he was governor of New Jersey, and then worked in several positions in the federal government, including serving as the press spokesman for the 9/11 Commission, co-chaired by Governor Kane and our own Congressman Lee Hamilton, with whom we had a lovely breakfast this morning. He holds a doctorate in political science from Princeton University and currently teaches at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Joining us as well to comment on Al's remarks, Paul Helmke, who needs no introduction to this group. Paul is the professor at SPIA, directs the Civic Leaders Living Learning community. We've just come back from meeting with a group of students, and you have not seen students as befuddled as when they're asked if they'd ever heard of Jackie Gleason.
Can you take the poll down? Google it.
Anyway, we think they understood.
He's a shortstop for the Yankees, right?
Yeah.
You're getting very warm.
The
You're the right city.
reference to Groucho Marx, but we're not sure. We had a nice time as Civic Leaders, and as I'm sure many of you know, Paul served as mayor of Fort Wayne, Indiana for several terms, and also was the executive director of the Brady Gun Control Organization before coming 5 years ago now to Indiana University. Well, Al's been with us. We start our Tocqueville programs in, I should give a plug for the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, which is actually the official sponsor, which means the money goes through them, of the Tocqueville program. So we started out with some presentations in Indianapolis and have been down here since yesterday evening. And we want, and Al has been talking a lot about, and I'm sure we'll talk some today as well, of the intellectual evolution of William F. Buckley. But we also wanted to focus today's discussion a little bit differently. It's not what's covered in the book, but the book may shed light on it. We'll know at the end of today's session, on what would William F. Buckley Jr., who did so much to build the conservative political and intellectual movement in the United States, think of the state of conservatism in the Donald Trump era. And just, I guess, last weekend, there've been, if you haven't been to watch this, it's not quite like the intellectual migration from Europe to England and the United States before World War II, but it's approaching that. So there are several people who have been migrating from the pages of the Wall Street Journal to the pages of the New York Times to continue their writing, one of which is well-known, Brent Stevens. The other is less well-known, but is an interesting woman named Barry Weiss. And just this past weekend, she produced a column entitled "The Trump Debate Inside Conservative Citadels." And I paid special, it grabbed me right away, because the first sentence is, "Last week, the venerable Hudson Institute," which many of you know I used to run, a think tank founded in the early 1960s, invited 3 speakers to discuss foreign policy. Leon Panetta and David Petraeus fit comfortably in the establishment mold in which Hudson has long operated. Not so the third speaker, Stephen K. Bannon. And the column goes on from there, talking about think tanks in Washington, the American Enterprise Institute, the Manhattan Institute, and the Heritage Foundation, whose president, Edward Fuller, proclaimed in a recent letter that Donald Trump was a real conservative, or words to that effect. The writer bemoans what she sees as accommodation, for the most part, with a few exceptions like George Will, of conservative thinkers and writers to the administration of a person that she obviously doesn't regard as the bearer of the conservative flag. So we thought this would be a good way to get going. Bill Buckley's own magazine, National Review, during the election, took a very strong stand opposed to Donald Trump, although depending on, some have suggested maybe the stance is becoming less opposed as the presidency goes on. So the question, rephrased a little bit before I turn over to our guest, is, okay, if Bill Buckley were alive and editing National Review, what would he be saying about the current trend of conservatism in American politics, and what does that portend for the future of the movement that he began, built over a 50-year period easily? So with those easy questions, Al, I'll turn it to you.
Wow. Well, it's always dangerous to assume how people no longer with us would come out on certain issues right now. I can't imagine myself asking James Madison what he would think about the FAA and its current administrative problems. Okay, but with Buckley, we got a couple of clues. We have only one line that he used about Donald Trump, which appeared in the year 2000. Now, one thing about Bill, he occupied every platform available to humankind at his time, long before they had Facebook, long before they had. He barely could make it with email, but he got used to email near the end. But didn't have Facebook, didn't have, God knows, he didn't have Twitter. And he wouldn't have used Twitter because he used multisyllabic words. Couldn't get past the character limit, right? But he wrote a few things. One thing about Trump, but I said he occupied all these platforms. He was the king of print, a magazine and a newspaper column in its height that had 500 newspapers carrying him per week. We don't have 500 newspapers in this country at the moment. He was the host of Firing Line, 33 years on PBS, longest running public affairs show with a single host. He permeated into the popular culture. Some of you may know the Disney film Aladdin. Now they're redoing it, and I'm very upset because Buckley, like Jackie Gleason, may be excised, but the people don't know. Young kids don't know who they're watching. But when the first Aladdin came out, there's a scene of William F. Buckley emerging as the genie, and with full clipboard accent, big pen in hand, and striped tie, with a wonderful Robin Williams impersonation. Okay? So when you crack into the popular culture at that level, right? As old geezers here remember Roland and Martin. They had a show called Laugh-In. He went on that. Woody Allen had a very short-running comic hour. He was on that. He was on Johnny Carson all the time. Could match jokes with jokes. So he got through to the popular culture. So he left a lot behind, and we can put a few things together. Let me separate the programmatic issues from some of the organizational issues. Take them first. Buckley, all his life, he never saw a tax cut that he disliked, and he never saw an arms control treaty that he did like. Right? That wouldn't change with the persona of the President of the United States. If people were writing him for opinion right now, he would say, well, whoever the president is, if I really believe that tax cuts were ways to stimulate the economy, I can't oppose this one, although I would say that we should take it in the context of its time. He was one of the few on the right to embrace Jack Kennedy's tax cut in the early 60s. In fact, it was wonderful. John Kenneth Galbraith, who's one of Buckley's big debating partners, whose photo is over there, and an award given to agricultural economists of the Midwest in Galbraith's honor. Galbraith hit the ceiling when Kennedy proposed this radical tax cut in the early 60s. The debate was, do you spend more, get America moving again? Well, moving again, it's not great again. In fact, it was great. He said it was great. It would be better, right? We can do better. Not we're living in what did he say? Carnage, as President Obama. All right. What did he say?
American carnage.
American carnage. It's not the same thing. But Galbraith told Kennedy it was the worst program, economic program from a Democrat's point of view since William McKinley. And Buckley was endorsing it because he thought there was a way of money not taken from the federal government would find its way into creative industries. And in the 20s, when Calvin Coolidge and Andrew Mellon cut taxes 4 times, that money made its way into aviation, communication, and into all sorts of new industries. The average family could afford a Model T car. Radios became universal. And he said it was going to happen again with Jack Kennedy. He said it was Ronald Reagan. He's finally going to start opposing it because Donald Trump is supporting it. On the other hand, Buckley was a free trader all his life. Buckley was for NAFTA before we had NAFTA. And National Review lost a lot of subscribers and had a tremendous battle with the Milliken family that used to take the last page of National Review religiously. And he told Roger Milliken that he would give him space in the magazine. This would be debated. But at the end of the day, we are what we are, and we hope that you would support us, but even if you're not. Now, I found I used to work for Ed Felder. I was at Heritage during the Bush fore election, and I have to say I found that letter appalling because the same conversation ensued at Heritage. Heritage is very strong in free trade. Roger Milliken, again, was a generous donor, and he said, Roger, we want to be with you, but we're not going to be with you on this one, and we hope you stay with us, but if you leave us, we're still going to be for it. I can't imagine Buckley looking very kindly at this kind of selling out. But more than programmatic, in fact, I actually had somebody tell me, well, I'll come back to that because I want to tell you this first. What would I call Buckley conservatism? And maybe there is a role for it in the future. I hope so. He grew up at a time where Calvin Coolidge, who I mentioned earlier, was in the White House. Calvin didn't think he had to be God can't imagine what Calvin would be doing on Twitter. I mean, he didn't think the president would say much at all, and he was attacked being Calvin silent calf, right? His great line, which we should put on the wall of the White House, is, "They can't hang you for what you don't say." Hello? Okay. When Coolidge was president, the federal government had a very low impact on people's lives. When he and Mellon were through with the tax cuts that were put out in World War I, well, the income tax comes in 1913, and then it's very small, and then in World War I it just skyrockets because we fought the war with taxation and borrowing. In any event, he got it down to a point that I think 70% of the people pay no income tax at all. But when he was president, government was smaller, less intrusive. When people talked about the government, they were talking about Borough Hall, where they would go for a dog license. Right? And with the cars coming in, they needed to register their car. Now we're talking about the state capitol, maybe, with branches around. That was it. Now they cut defense too much, as we learned out in Pearl Harbor. Okay, they weren't perfect. But in a large way, Buckley tried throughout his career to return power to the states. Community control, we talked about that when he ran for mayor. He had some innovative ideas. Welfare reform, which we can talk about. I don't want to talk too long, so I want to hear from all of you. My favorite was he said he could understand why the city of New York raised money by selling taxi medallions, which guarantees that there'd be a shortage of taxis whenever there's an opening night on Broadway, or a snowstorm, or a rainstorm that can't find a cab. Why can't anybody with no criminal record and a good driving record rent out spaces in his car to other passengers? Well, you know this is Uber. A lot of creative things. But he believed in communities that one size doesn't fit all. And he had a lot to say in the 60s. He became a great advocate, among other things, of the Black Power movement. Who would have thought, right? Whitney Young was a great civil rights leader who died too young. No pun intended. He should have gone on for decades. He was, it was a tragedy. He passed on. But Moynihan was working, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, as an advisor for Richard Nixon. And he came up with the idea with Whitney Young, we ought to take a bunch of conservative journalists, or a bunch of journalists, and send them on a tour of the inner city, show them what's going on. And Buckley was one of 25 journalists put on a tour. And they went to Cleveland, they went to L.A., they went to Chicago, Washington, D.C., several other places. And not to talk to these black militants he was reading so much about and probably writing so much against at the time. And after a couple of conversations, he figured out, they sound just like me. What is going on here? They don't like federal intervention. They don't like one size fits all. They want to have a say over how their children are educated and what they're learning. They're complaining about some corruption at some police departments. So he's a great believer in law enforcement. He loved the New York City cops. His first speech he ran for mayor was for the Holy Name Society of the New York City Police Department. But that said, he's in Chicago, and one of these fellows is pointing across the street, and he says, you see that cop going into that liquor store? He's going to come out with 3 shopping bags of goodies. You know what's going on in the back? What's going on in the back is a numbers racket. This is before we had lottery tickets, right? Right? And the cops are getting protection money. And they're paying them in liquor. They're paying them in other things. And he's basically threatening them. I don't get Johnny Walker Black, then I'm gonna call you in, right? They're supposed to protect us. I mean, he winds up quoting his debating adversary James Baldwin about neighborhoods feeling that they're being paroled by an occupied army. It's the United States. And he says, I could be one of them, except for accident of birth and circumstance and financial assets of our parents and all that. But they've been saying what I've been saying all my life. And the answer is decentralization. One size doesn't fit all. Community control. And he says, you love this one. He said, within 10 years, he writes for Look magazine, one of these, quote, community organizers, this is his word, is going to be the first black president of the United States. Well, you could see far ahead, but he was too quick on that one. It took 20 years, or maybe 30 years. It did take 10, but you get the point. He was always growing, always adapting. So that was one of the tenets of Buckley's conservatism, based on incentive. He ran for mayor, came up with the idea, look, it's very easy to cut welfare. Every conservative wants to cut welfare. We're going to make the welfare recipient the victim. Everybody's going to feel good about wasting money. What happens the day after you cut welfare? We don't let people die in the streets of the United States, particularly parents of children. This is not how we do things in this country. We're going to try to teach people that they would live a better life off welfare. Welfare is not a goal, it's a means. But as Moynihan tells us, 3 generations, we've lost the incentive structure, we lost any hope. And what we have to do is show people that, first of all, they keep their benefits. They don't scare everybody to death. Right? Number one, they have a house over their head, a roof over their head, they keep their children, they keep their benefits. But they want to go to work, and they want to take a program. They can keep the benefits as they learn a skill. If they don't have sufficiently developed skills, we will pay to train them, whether it be an apprentice program with a factory or an employer, whether it be finishing school or a high school equivalency degree, whether they want to go into a detox program. And they can keep some of what they make, most of what they make. They'll keep their daycare. They'll keep part of their health care, or all of their health care. And eventually they will learn that the goal would be that the lowest paying job is worth more than to them, in many ways, than the highest paying benefit. And that will create a sense of pride and an example for the children that are coming up afterwards. That was his welfare proposal. It comes back in modified, it was initially a Moynihan proposal, like many things that he said he stole from Moynihan. He stole so many things from Moynihan. Moynihan once said he was going to sue Buckley for plagiarism. And Buckley had 2 lines for the, quote, learned professor at Harvard. 1, stealing from the Bible does not make it less true. And 2, a man who spends his life grading student papers ought to look at the footnotes. I cite him in every speech I make. Those are the 2 responses to what being accused of stealing from Moynihan. All right. Well, this theft comes back under a fellow named Bill Clinton who Gingrich. That was the welfare proposal that they put into plan. I think it was 95 or 96. That's what Bill was about. That's one said. Then they got the programs, and you got good federalism. Right? One side doesn't fit all. Not one program for 50 states. He would have loved the idea of waivers. You're going to have Obamacare. Let the people out. Give them a chance to do things differently and creatively and meet a standard maybe, but it doesn't always work the same. But the heart of it, I think, we talked yesterday about the framers' view of human nature. What separates conservatives from liberals is conservatives believe 5,000 years of human experience have taught us how people will behave. The very existence of war is proof of how people behave. Well, what is human nature, right? Judeo-Christian tradition tells us man is a fallen being, and if allowed to his own devices, will be avaricious, will be selfish, maybe even aggressive. And the framers had this great debate. They all came out of that tradition. And Madison came up with this geometrical puzzle called the U.S. Constitution, with its separate institutions sharing power. Madison argues one way to deal with it is suppress it and gulag. Right? Then you have no creativity. You're not going to have an Einstein or Mozart. They can't express themselves to the fullest of their capacity. The other way is to come up with a system where interest will tackle interest, and no one will be supreme, and every vote will be another coalition of a coinciding of interest. No faction will be controlling everybody. And that's the genius of the American political system. So power should be, first of all, what is the Constitution but limiting authority? That's number one. Number two, the Constitution reflects the pluralism in this great country, which de Tocqueville recognized. You give me 15 people settling a new town, within 20 minutes there'll be a library. Within a half hour there might be a symphony orchestra. Within an hour and a half, someone's going to start a school. And when you get enough of schools in a couple of communities, you might even get a university. And then you get this genius named Abraham Lincoln, who figured out. It was around before Milton Friedman, and in many ways just as good an economist. All right? He figured out you teach people how to plant, they won't be coming to the government for programs. And none of Lincoln's programs are mandates. They're all voluntary. The Homestead Act, you develop something, it's yours in 5 years. You don't want to do it? Fine. You want to stay in Boston, hanging around Harvard Yard, drinking your latte? That's also fine. Land-grant colleges. You don't have to go, but if a state wants it, we'll set aside so many acres and a formula based on the number of senators and congressmen from the state. And they sold it, which you probably could only do in the Midwest. They sold it as an agriculture program. They sent it only seeds, right? But, you know, we're at one of those big institutions now. And he saw ahead. And that's what made us an international power. Lincoln saw this coming. Program after program. That was Bill Buckley to a T. But as Tocqueville recognized that, the role that mediating institutions play, I forgot to say those 12 people would probably have had 3 newspapers. And by the way, when Buckley was growing up, he was one of 10 children. It's okay. They had their own newspaper to communicate with each other, and he was an editor at an early age. You figured that one out. But, okay, well, he would have said that the most important thing is checking power. The most important thing is nobody wins all the time. Compromise is the American way. Slow, steady progress. So what would he say now? He would say to Paul Ryan, you're a wonderful fellow, Paul. I knew you when you worked for Jack Kemp, who used to sound like me. Right? Jack Kemp was a great acolyte of Buckley learned a lot from Kemp. Kemp learned a lot from Buckley, and they both learned a lot from Milton Friedman. And he would say, you've been a congressman for 16 years. You are the leader of a co-equal branch of government, half of it, and the other half is McConnell, but you are a spokesman for a separate branch of government. You've been in Congress for 16 years, you have 3 children, you have no idea about what a good healthcare system would look like. You're waiting for the president's program. You have control of the Congress. You've had it 2 or 3 times. You promised to do something about it. Well, go ahead and do something about it. Let him sign it. Let him veto it. Talk to him. That's how we come out at the end of the day. He would tell Senator Cornyn, who I heard last week, say that, I forgot what the issue was, but he said he was for the president's program. He'll find out what it is in about 20 minutes. Right? All right. We're not here to have a society of martinets. Now, this started before Trump. There's no question about it. And you heard that I had served in the 9/11 Commission, and I was horrified when at the end of the work that Lee Hamilton and Tom Kean and all the rest of us did, we had a proposal to reform the intel system of the United States. The first time the CIA was reformed, since it was created, no one actually tried to reform it. And ways of communicating between the FBI and the CIA, which did not happen in 9/11. And all the rest of it, to see nothing about certain aspects of the Pentagon that were being changed. And Dennis Hastert, the speaker then, announces that nothing gets to the floor unless it has a majority of the majority party. Really? So let's be charitable. Half the country were Democrats. Al-Qaeda didn't care what your party was, what your nationality was, what your religion was, what your affectional preference was. You're in that building, and you're a target. You're out. But half the country has no say in what kind of intel bill because the Speaker said so. Majority party. That really meant one person, didn't it? It meant the administration, meant the president, and in that case, the vice president, who was pushing that very heavily. It was not the beginning of it, but it was beginning to happen. And we're hearing that now. We're hearing that with Trump's constant attacks on Cone, constant now attacks on the filibuster. And you know what a filibuster is. One senator could hold up in the name of free speech debate. Okay. Well, they couldn't get 51 votes. Now, couldn't get 51 senators to vote for their own health care repeal. I don't know what they're bringing up the filibuster for. Okay. But what they really want is one. And that's what happened with Tom DeLay and Dennis Hastert. Really want was one. If you have 51 and you pass the president's program lockstep, okay, and really saying that they're a bunch of martinets. They've given up their scepter. Okay, they have gone the way of the Roman Senate. I mean, without the senator as colorful as the people politically names. But nevertheless, that's what they're saying. Buckley would have said rubbish to that. He was long a critic of executive power. God knows, he grew up in a house where he heard his father curse Roosevelt every night. Right. That man, right? They didn't use his name in certain places because it would set up heart palpitations in certain parts of the country, right? And even now, if you talk to your grandparents, right, there are Roosevelt people who despised him, and there were people who adored him, right? And that was part of that. And he said, look, in the short run, once Stalin got the bomb, okay, we're not going to win this with 500 congressmen acting like 7-year-olds in a soccer match, right? Once he got the bomb, we're going to have a Pentagon. And we're going to have to consolidate under the executive. That is the way wars are fought, managed, and won. But absent the existential threat, absent the Soviet Union, you begin to see some cracks in the old formula. And he begins to return a little bit to the politics of his youth, when his hero was Robert Taft, where Robert Taft had the domestic vision that I just outlined. And Taft is always seen as the great isolationist of the period, and he was that, but at least a softer view of American involvement abroad. Softer view. And regarding George W. Bush, his argument was, look, if the best intel at your command tells you that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, in my view, Buckley said, I'd rather you go in and be embarrassed by not finding them than not go in and have 350 million lives in jeopardy and nothing about our allies. But since you didn't find them, what are we doing here? All right, right? 7 years of an occupation trying to stop the Iraqis for doing to each other what they would be doing if we weren't there, basically continue their civil war. The French helped us a lot. A lot of people thought the French won the American Revolution for us. But they got out of here. They let us make our own mistakes. They let us fight about our own constitution. God knows we had our own civil war without too many, people with their French cooks at the battlefield. Right? Okay. Well, it's time we lowered the flag a notch, okay? So some of this, what we're seeing, this fraying of, old Cold War kind of politics and coalition, was starting long before Trump. Can't blame Trump for that. We can say that Trump was very shrewd in seeing this breaking down, seeing the growing divide between the leaders and the led. We can say that. And we can also say that the pollsters didn't see it coming because, in my opinion, I haven't seen this written much. Who do pollsters poll? They look at Democratic precincts, they look at Republican precincts, and they try to call. They try to find equal samples, and if they can't, then they weight it to favor to take out any prejudice they'd find by that random distribution. I'm not saying this very well, but what do you do in a place like Erie County, Pennsylvania, which has been a Democratic county since there have been Democrats and counties, and it went for a vote twice? And what do you do when this becomes one of Donald Trump's banner counties? and it goes for Obama twice. It goes overwhelmingly for Donald Trump, and votes for every Democrat down the line. What kind of accounting is this? There's something going on here. Some of the politicians call it realignment. There's something unusual going on here. So they didn't see him coming, but he saw that there was some anger in the field. George Will said it first. There was a disconnect between the leaders and the latter. As he put it, there's something about the dogs that don't like dog food. Maybe they shoot the dog or get new dog food. He proposed new dog food. Yes, most Republicans like tax cuts, but tax cuts do not cure everything, including poison ivy. That the things bothering the American people may not necessarily be the tax cuts. And if Reagan's supply theory worked, and you cut taxes and it grows the economy, and that creates greater investment, the private side, as I talked about in the 20s, well, it's one thing to take the tax bracket, from the 80s and 90s, where it was near the end of World War I, right down to, 2%, where Calvin took it. Or Reagan brought it down from 70%, 34, 35%, then arguing about 39, ending at 36, it ain't going to do what it's proposing, even if you get it. I think Bill would have been attuned to it. Last point, I want to hear from the rest of you, and I'm going to stop. What was sacred to him was this Constitution and our system of government. He would not have traded constitutional liberties for a tax cut. He would have said, we should fight for both. He would say, when the president does propose something I like, I'm not going to stop liking it because he's proposing it. But darn it, these other things are very important. Mediating institutions, what are they? The things that Tocqueville talked about. He wasn't talking about only Congress. He was talking least about Congress. He was talking about those orchestras. He was talking about the Red Cross. He was talking about the libraries. He was talking about the symphonies. He was talking about the 4-H clubs. He was talking about the Knights of Columbus. He was talking about all these other groups that have provided so many scholarships for all of our children and our nephews and our nieces and our neighbors, created a whole sense of community. That didn't come from the government. That came from the American people. The whole sense of philanthropy. That's a great American export to the world. We should be boasting about it. Well, we have other free institutions. These institutions may be or may not be attacked by the tax policies that we have, not just now, but as we go ahead. The press. Well, all of us who are interviewed have stories we can tell about the press, right? We've all walked into Bus House. We don't like it. We all say stupid things. We don't want our neighbors to read about our stupid things that we say. We like to say them in private. But here's a case where there is really war on the press. And there's a situation that he doesn't like the way CNN treated him. And he said, as a candidate, that he's going to stop the merger with Time Warner. Well, for 1,000 reasons to stop the merger. But the fact that they don't like the president, or they don't see what the president would want said about him, is not one of those 1,000 reasons to oppose the merger. The courts. You attack the courts. I'd love to see what he says if the current Supreme Court, with his own nominee, vote against him on a certain issue. But he's now argued that a justice cannot be blind, that a justice casts decisions based on the justice's ethnic background, even though the justice is born in the United States and consider himself an American.
From Indiana.
From Indiana. I mean, appalling. That's what Buckley would say. And last point. If you don't hear, if our students, now that I've been here for 3 days, said they're on their mind, if our students don't remember Jackie Gleason, okay, or Walter Cronkite, or any of the great names of our childhood, okay. It's just a fascinating thing. They don't remember, and they probably don't know anything about the John Birch Society, thank God. Okay, when I was a kid, the John Birch Society thrived in an area where we were terrified of nuclear war. We had air raid drills, remember? We called it civil defense. And we would go to the basement of a school so many times a week or a month or a year, whatever, during the school year.
Under the desk?
And we either go under the desk, or in my case, we would lean against our lockers in the basement. Brilliant defense strategy. Nikita Khrushchev would blow up Madison Avenue Elementary School, and everybody's sure to be crushed to death by the weight of the concrete and the lockers, but we still did this. And the idea was to let us know that we were on a war footing. It probably was not to protect us very much, but to let us know we were on a war footing. Well, so the John Birch Society comes along, and he says, yes, the United States did have a series of diplomatic and military setbacks in the 50s. We were shocked when the Soviets tested a nuclear bomb 5 years, 10 years before the CIA said they could. We were horrified when our ally Shanghai Shek loses the Civil War that we didn't know much about. We were stunned that half of a country we never heard of, called Korea, invades another half of the country we never heard of, and we're suddenly at war again. And so this organized group of conspiracy theorists called the John Birch Society decided it's not because of human failure or even because of any skill on the other side. It's a result of treason at home, and our government is in the hands of the communists. The biggest communist of all is the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the conscious agent of the Soviet conspiracy. Hello? All right. William Buckley and Robert Welsh, the founder of the society who was putting this out, they had the same view about tax cuts, right? They had probably the same identical view about the goals of the Soviet Union. But Buckley decides, and this is a lesson for the students here, those of you who want to go into public service, the weakest link in the chain is going to be used by that movement's enemies to characterize it, to obscurify it, to make it look fanatic. And our weakest link is Robert Welsh. I'm going to take this guy on, big time. And he does. He loses donors. He loses readers. He's getting sacks of mail saying, why aren't you spending your time attacking communists? Why are you attacking fellow conservatives who share your view about Khrushchev's intentions toward conquering the world? And that was his response. Weakest link in the chain is going to be used to ridicule and demonize the chain. I don't care if we're talking about feminists, civil rights groups, environmental groups, gay groups, keep going. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to keep my movement free. And he said his greatest achievement was keeping the movement free of racist, bigots, conspiracy theorists, sordid paranoids, anti-Semites, and racists. Well, your question. A man, again, without talking to him, without having any seances, which we could arrange maybe, but the answer is a man who did that would have nothing but contempt for a man who came on the national scene by taking stories about the President of the United States not being born in this country from the sewer to the living room. And now this media that he so hates enabled that. And all eyes should be cast on Greta Van Susteren. She put him on for a year on Fox, and he was spouting this drivel day after day after day. The only reporter, I'm finally getting to why I hate cable, the only reporter that tried to call him out on that was Will Flitzer. And remember, when we had three networks, they were business enterprise, and CBS, ABC, and NBC. William Paley, great man, founded CBS, or the president of CBS. He told Walter Cronkite, who many of your colleagues haven't heard of. Okay, all right. And Walter Cronkite was the quote most believed man in America, which said George Gallup. And Lyndon Johnson reportedly said, if I don't have Walter Cronkite on Vietnam, I've lost middle America. All right, maybe he said it, maybe he didn't say it. But he told Walter, your job is to report the news. Your job is not to sell soap and other awful products that you get advertised when you watch the news. I've never met anybody with those many elements. But nevertheless, they're killing, arguing for an older audience. But I don't expect Walter to sell soap for me or cars. I've got Lucille Ball, Gunsmoke, and Perry Mason for that. Thank you. We're selling entertainment, and we're providing the news as a service. Well, now when they push the news off cable, and now it's all-day entertainment, what do we have? Food fights. Why? Food fights are good for ratings. And what do ratings do? It allows them to increase the price of their commercial advertising. The only Wolf Blitzer said to Trump, you said you had all these investigators in Hawaii looking into the circumstances of our president's birth. And you said, quote, you wouldn't believe what they found. Well, I'm asking you, Mr. Trump, what did they find? And he gets, I don't talk about that anymore. Imagine getting away with that. And I'll bet you that Wolf Blitzer had somebody with his earphone telling him, don't follow up, because if he walks off the set, his viewers will go with him right to Fox and right across the street, wherever he came from. They had a role in this. And he was able to exploit this. Remember, in the second primary debate, he was upset about whoever the moderator was going to be. Remember that? And that he's not going to show up. He's going to make a charitable gift to veterans.
For the troops.
Remember that? The troops. And then the troops had to start screaming for weeks to get the check. All right. But when he showed the lesson, though, he stayed away, and viewership dropped considerably. He was saying, I built CNN, an audience of 30 million. I can take it with me. Well, very, very dangerous. I'll end with the one line we do have from Buckley about Trump. I said he occupied every possible platform. This did not run in a column. This did not run in National Review. Sadly, it ran in a publication hopefully none of us read. It's called Cigar Aficionado. No, he wrote for Esquire. I mean, he wrote for sailing magazines. He wrote for sporting magazines. He wrote everywhere you were, he found you. My favorite is his Playboy interview, where he tells them in a Playboy interview, he has nothing but contempt for the Playboy philosophy. He thinks the American people should stop reading it. And he hates the objectification of women on his pages. Well, they knew, why then are you talking to us? And he said that was the only way I could communicate with my 16-year-old son. So wherever you were, he found you. So somehow he chose to unload in this poor publication called Cigar Aficionado, which on the cover probably has Arnold Schwarzenegger with a cigar and all of that. And he said that there were three politicians who are only offering themselves to the American people rather than their program. And one was Arnold Schwarzenegger, one was Jesse Ventura, and one was Donald Trump. Now, the year was 2000, and Trump was thinking of running on the left then, right, as a successor to whatever this Ross Perot Independent Party was. And he withdrew because he didn't want to run with Pat Buchanan because he said he was upset about Pat Buchanan's past anti-Semitism and all things. Right? Okay. And Buckley said the more he got into it, the more he saw that of those three, only Schwarzenegger had somewhat of a familiarity with some issues. Well, Arnold did leave us a better environmental program than they had before, and he did deal with gerrymandering in some way, and he did try to deal with the fact that people don't vote in primaries by having this awful mishmash of a ticket. You can say, was it better, was it great, but he had some interest in some things. Jesse Ventura we pass over. He's now on Russia Today with Larry King and all the other has-beens of the 80s. Then we have Donald. And he said all three of them were offering their person. And he was very afraid of the cult of personality, which he said he had seen infest a good part of Europe when he was a boy growing up. And also, I'll say, he never quite resolved a basic dilemma in his mind and others. When do you have elitism versus populism? Never did. He might have used populist techniques when he ran for office to try to embarrass what he called then the liberal Republican Eastern establishment, which is gone. You can say pretty much gone. Might be a liberal Democratic establishment, but he would recognize gone. But he feared the mob. And I remember one of the great joys in doing something like that, and I hope you all get a chance to do some primary research, is it's one thing to read, what the story was in public, and you get to read the backstory to figure out what was going on in his head. I found a term paper that he wrote when he was in his second year at Millbrook, his prep school, for his headmaster. And it was about democracy. was not sure that democracy was a panacea for everything. Not that he liked tyranny, but he said, who gave 51% the right to tyrannize 49, whatever the issue happens to be? I don't care if it's a referendum or where to put a local hospital, but who gave them that right to do that? And then he got deeper, and he said he didn't trust the crowd. He didn't trust the beast of the crowd. There were reasons that we went to a republic, not a democracy. Crowds do very ugly things. They lead to lynchings. They lead to other kinds of violence. They destroy civic society. They turn on institutions. They turn on all the brakes we put in. And he would rather have those guards put in than pass his tax cut, although he would like his tax cut. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you for some brief comments. I'm going to hold a little bit of what I was going to say until the very end so we can get discussion going here.
Yeah, and I'd rather get the questions to it. It seems to me, though, that, and you touched briefly on this, that, I mean, when I think of Trump and then Buckley, the contrast in so many ways. I mean, one is just, I've seen some reports that Trump speaks at a third grade level in his public speaking. Obviously, Buckley was speaking, grad school level, perhaps, for most people. But the contrast there, and one of the issues in the 50s was anti-intellectualism in American society, Hofstadter and others. And then in the 60s, we saw George Wallace and populism tied with segregation. It seems to me that Buckley is almost the mirror image of Trump in some ways. Both New Yorkers, one intelligent, the other, I don't know. One monosyllabic and the other polysyllabic. Is this just the rise of anti-intellectualism again? I'm not sure what Trump stands for. I might agree with Trump on some things some days, but where is the thinking? Where is the thought? What's the intellectual basis? Buckley, Kemp, others Reagan had reasons for what they were doing. I'm not sure what Trump's reasons are for anything other than it's maybe good for Trump.
I'm completely with you. I don't think he's stupid in the conventional sense. He did figure out an opening. He did sense an opportunity. His political instincts aren't bad. He is president of the United States. I don't see anything but the personality in Trumpism, which is what Buckley called years ago. I do see a very dangerous ideology, though, in Mr. Bannon and what he's pushing.
If that's the intellectual basis for what he does.
It would appear. I mean, he's reading some very obscure theologians from a different century. It would mean nothing to you if I mentioned their names. He wants to be more Catholic than the current Pope. He's gotten involved in Vatican politics, doesn't like the Pope's outreach to certain groups and certain doctrine. And I reminded one of the students last night that the word Nazi comes from a combination of nationalism, white nationalism, primarily Aryan nationalism, primarily, and socialism. And when I hear him talk about a realigning election that brings the Bernie voters together with the Trump voters and economic issues, there was a lot of that in Wallace. You mentioned him. A lot of that in Wallace. Buckley couldn't stand Wallace, and one of the great services he did for Richard Nixon and maybe the United States was Wallace, too, was running as a third-party candidate. His goal was to try to throw the election into the House by taking enough states off the board to deny Humphrey or Nixon electoral margin. And to do it, he chose to take his message to some of the northern states, capitalize on white, what was called white backlash to civil rights bills and African American aspirations at the time, in the pretext of stopping crime. Buckley had him on the show, and he said, "You're nothing. You say you're a small government conservative, as I see the term. You mean you don't want federal intervention? You don't want federal intervention regarding immigration, but you take federal intervention on everything else. You take highway money, you take agricultural money, you take education money. You just want black children being educated. You're nothing but a welfare populist. Lyndon Johnson pays for 60% of your budget. You're a fraud." And once Nixon gets nominated, he writes a long piece for Look magazine. And it's an open letter to conservatives telling conservatives, don't be taken in by this guy. You might not like Mr. Nixon. I've had my issues with Mr. Nixon. But there really is a more conservative on the ballot, not that Nixon governed that way, but do not be taken in by this demagogue. And I'm quoting him pretty much directly. And it was a letter of conservatives. And a lot of conservatives moving away from Nixon because they remembered he was a great moderate under Dwight Eisenhower, which is why National Review did not support Nixon the first time he ran for president. But by 68, he's saying, look, he may not be Mr. Goldwater, but he's not this. Don't dare go with that. So I can't figure out Mr. Trump's personality. He takes like positions to get the pressure off him. And then each time he does that, he sows the seed of the next scandal. Right? So who are your foreign policy advisor? Myself. You don't believe it. Well, I watch television. Well, so the first two clunkers who walk in the door are his Henry Kissingers, and now we're dealing with that, right? And now, of course, they're saying, well, who let these drags in? Well, can't imagine. They're sitting at a table with the candidate. I mean, they just, appeared by thin air. That's what worries me. But Bannon worries me more, because I think that he's already planning for the post-Trump era.
Just one other thing real quick. Another thing that strikes me as a major difference is just the coarsening of discourse.
Yes.
Ignore the intellectual basis for it. And Buckley, well-known number of arguments, but all Mailer, others, and maybe a phrase here or a word here and there that might be personal attacks, but completely different level of discourse and treatment of people by Trump.
Yeah. Well, no ability to be embarrassed. It's amazing. You can say one thing about Richard Nixon, he did quit. He quit out of a sense of shame. And he quit out of a sense of, he was a patriot. He did love his country. He messed up. And he may not have been a very good president by lots of means, but he really understood that at the end he had a battle of the court. He didn't try to send out the army. I never thought when, in 1962, we were watching 7 Days in May, and I never thought that we'd be praying for 7 Days in May to have the generals basically contain the civilian command. 7 Days in May was about a military coup, taking out a Kennedy-type candidate. I never thought we'd be praying for this, that the military is going to protect us from the civilian commander. When I worked at the Pentagon, it was just the other. No matter what commission the officer had, they would always tell you that they were supporting it to the civilian commander, and right now we're saying we're not so sure. Dangerous. Dangerous. In the long run, very dangerous. In the short run, it might keep us from nuclear war, but in the long run, I don't know.
Let's open up to questions.
Open up.
Yeah.
Zach.
I have a question, and then so it just as a way of background, so Les and Aurelian have brought great speakers recently, and talking about this issue of the day. So Gregory Cabot Service, who you're probably aware of, in his book Rule and Ruin, about
Yeah, I know him. He's a good guy. Yeah.
radicalization of the Republican Party.
Right.
And I don't recall his name, but an anthropologist who was looking at state politics in Kansas as the bellwether, anticipating the.
Yes. What's wrong with Kansas?
Well, it was
No,
not
it's
that
another
fellow,
one.
but the
Okay,
same.
all right.
So the same trend. So the question is more generally than about the Republican Party, and so Trump is an issue to it. But I'm concerned about Trump, but I'm also concerned about the Republican Party.
Absolutely.
So to take the issue, this issue of the healthcare issue.
Yeah.
So the Republican efforts both at repeal and then their replace. So to look at the process under which it was done, and then to take something that Professor Helmke said about reason giving. And so you have in the history of the Republican Party, you have the William Buckleys, you have the Crystals, you have people who, and you have conceivably politicians who give reasons. And so I support this policy for this reason. This policy will have this outcome, and this is a good outcome. When we look at what the Republicans were doing with health care, there was no reason giving, as far as I could tell. But what also was very troubling was the dishonesty. the disingenuousness and dishonesty. So saying like, not quibbling with the CBO score, there won't be 30 million people who lose health insurance, it'll be 28 million, but that the trend is entirely wrong, or that's what freedom looks like, or that this is actually a healthcare planner will give you good healthcare when it takes money out of the market. So how do you diagnose this? Is this an aberrant? Is this a new phenomenon in politics? This level of bald-faced dishonesty and post-truth era, and what does the Republican Party, where does it stand?
Well, I hate to say this, but I consider myself a Republican all my life. I don't know what I am now. I worked for 10 years on the Hill, 6 years for Tom Davis, who was one of my role models, and a wonderful guy who should come here sometime. I told you that Buckley was willing to lose support, lose donors, maybe even lose the magazine over something extremely important like this country. John Kennedy wrote a book about profiles of courage. We hear about it a lot. We can argue with his examples, and we can even argue whether he lived up to what he professed. But there was a time that people said the national interest mattered more than my political career. I was gone, very few. The people willing to take him on are leaving Congress.
Or dying.
Well, we pray for his recovery. But healthy or ill, I think this is McCain's last term. Let's put it that way. But he's playing to another orchestra right now, and but he always did some of that. But the others, they're leaving now. They can attack him. The ones staying are calculating to what extent. That's why that article so upset me. To what extent can they sort of snuggle up to him? Well, you can't snuggle up to him. Ed Gillespie proved that. When Ed Gillespie was running, I can be a Trump candidate without Trump. I'm not going to ask him to come campaign for me. I was the epitome of the swamp. Right? I was the RNC chairman. I was a super lobbyist. I was a lobbyist for Enron. I wrote speeches for Dick Armey. I wrote speeches for George Bush. I am as mainstream as they come. And I'm going to now take myself and put myself into the sewer in areas where Trump ran very well, but I'm going to outvote him, which he did in southwestern Virginia. These are Democratic counties, like I told you about Erie County, Pennsylvania. These were counties that were so poor they didn't even have any digital communications at all until Mark Waters was down there and put it there and was attacked by the Republicans for being a socialist for doing that. You can't get more Democratic and it can't get more red now. He led Trump there. On the other hand, Loudoun County, as blue as the sky now. It used to be a swing county, it used to be a Republican. When I moved to Washington to work for Bush 41, it was the horsey country. Yes, it was melon country. The only Democrat allowed was Jackie Kennedy because she went riding there. It was as Bush as you can get, and as blue as you can, and now as red as you can get. Now, it was the Democrats' best county, and lost by 30 points. What did he get out of it? His lesson completely lost on them. They're all still trying to morph themselves onto Trump where he's popular. But what bothers me more, if they want to do that, they want to walk the plank and give Nancy Pelosi back the gavel. By the way, someone else they keep underestimating, where they keep talking about how old she is. This lady knows how to raise money, and she is the daughter of a machine-backed, all the way, but mayor of Baltimore. When we had two forms of Democrats. We called them these Democrats and those Democrats. And he ran Baltimore with an iron glove for many years. She is a tough lady, and they keep underestimating her. She might be speaker again. Of course, that's why she hung on. She knows an idiot she's dealing with on the other side. It's true. You can quote me on that. But what bothers me more is the article that Les sent me, because it's one thing to say, well, the president's going off this way. Another thing to say, the Republicans are following off the ship like lemmings jumping into the ocean. But they're advancing on every aspect of the conservative infrastructure that made the Reagan presidency possible. There's this family named Mercer. They are trying to get on every one of the boards of conservative organizations, and like Trojan horses, in exchange for the money, are trying to reshape it in Trump's image. That's why Heritage Foundation. They want, you get a guy, I don't know how much they're worth, mucho billion, that's a short number. They go on the Heritage Foundation, they dangle 2, 5, 10 billion, a billion, I don't know what they're giving him. Suddenly the whole foundation is turned tipsy top. Now we're going Manhattan Institute. You mentioned several others. You mentioned Hudson. Keep going. Everyone can be bought, which is what Trump has said about himself, right? Why did the Clintons go to your wedding? His answer, well, I do business in New York, and they danced to my tune. Here's how much I gave Hillary. Was he wrong? I've never seen a more cynical president in my life. And if I'm not going to get what I want, I'm going to bring down the whole temple. Amazing to me. I don't have an answer to your question. I said that it's appalling that Paul does not have a health care plan. It's more appalling the media doesn't say, what's your health care plan? What is your health care plan? If God talked to you now, what would you tell him to do about the American people and their health care? Look into the camera right now, you get 10 seconds. I mean, it doesn't happen. I wish I had an answer. Somebody else.
Another question, comment?
Yes, sir.
What would, as you said, Buckley really had his own media empire.
Oh, yes.
But
Yes, he did.
I think what I would so call the press is in deep trouble in this country. Forget about cable, the problems you indicated. Would Buckley have been out there telling people, subscribe to the New York Times, subscribe to the Washington Post, subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, subscribe to your local paper, you need to be informed? Would he have maintained faith in the news media and have fought against this propaganda that labels anything that one doesn't like fake news?
Oh, yes. First of all, he would have agreed that the press has a liberal bias. I mean, he said so in the Nixon administration. And he supported a number of folks and enterprises that attacked the press for being very lockstep against the administration. Remember Edith Efron and what was that, the News Twisters? Mm-hmm. She did a content analysis of the coverage of the Nixon and Humphrey campaign for CBS, NBC, and ABC, and lo and behold, 70% or something like that of the Humphrey stories are positive, and 70% of the Nixon stories are negative. Okay, all right. But first of all, he subscribed to all those papers. He contributed to all those papers. He could have gone on Fox News and made an idiot of himself every night, which he would never do. I think he gave one Hannity interview in his life, and that was that. I never saw him on O'Reilly. But in the latter days, he would say what he said when he was on PBS. I want to talk to the other side. The conservatives will find me. They're very smart. They know where I am on the dial. They can look at TV Guide, right? Or they can go to the internet. I want to go with Charlie Rose because I want to talk to them. I want to persuade them. We have to have a debate. I don't want to be in my own communications and get up, and neither should you. But yeah, I still may share some of the president's biases, he might say. I don't believe that they're covering issues the way I would cover them. But I don't think they should be shut down. And I think the answer to that, he would say, is more competition, not less competition. I don't know what he'd think of the internet. I mean, I don't know how you get out of this bubble where entertainment becomes news. So if you're a producer at NBC, who's going to get you more ratings? Dick Lugar, a great statesman from this state, or Louis Gohmert, right? Or this Peter King from Iowa, right? Idiot. But you put these people on, and then you get a screamer from the other side, and you can actually see the barometer hit the ceiling, and tide is increasing. It's advertising. It's charged more money to advertise, and they get a chance to see more people. I don't have an answer to that, and I find it also interesting that here was a man that I said believed in small government, probably in an abstract world would oppose public television by definition, and yet he spent 33 years not having to worry about ratings on PBS and did benefits for PBS. So I don't know what to say, but no, he would not say shut down newspapers. He would fight it. And he would subscribe to them. He did, yes.
Well, I'm sort of interested in why people vote for this man. You know, I mean, I don't think the American people are as dumb as, especially Trump voters, as nearly as dumb as they're made out to be by certain segments of the press. I wonder, I mean, they know that the guy is not perfect, but he was really promising substantial change. And I just wonder if this isn't linked into what we used to call secular stagnation. That opportunities for the American middle class are dwindling.
Of course.
People have a deep-rooted sense that the system is broken, isn't working
course.
for them, that education is not paying off the way it once did. You know, underemployment is still very, very high, despite the official statistics, which are to a certain extent cooked. So are the inflation statistics, by the way. And I just wonder if this isn't sort of the tip of an iceberg of extreme anger that lurks below the surface, festering.
Well, I think perhaps correct. On the other hand, all people with legitimate grievances did not vote for him. And policymakers in the last several Congresses and in the last two, maybe three administrations, did not respond enough. We've heard about income inequality for a very long time. We've heard about losing jobs for a very long time. But they've heard two consecutive presidential candidates laugh at them. We've heard Hillary call half of the electorate, 40% of the electorate, deplorables. We heard Mitt Romney out of nowhere resurrect Ayn Rand, by the way, Buckley detested. Ayn Rand's view of Atlas Shrugged on givers and takers. Calling half of this country takers? Are you out of your mind? When Romney said that, I fell off my sofa. I mean, the veteran did not think that he's a taker. He thinks he has earned that, and that was the cost of keeping us free. That was part of the contract. Old folks do not think, who were denied a chance to invest their money more wisely than the government when they were in their 20s and 30s, being called takers because they're getting whatever the Social Security system tells them they should have now. They don't think they're takers. And so when you hear that from two presidential candidates, one a Democrat, one a Republican, you get madder. One woman was on MSNBC yesterday. She said she doesn't expect Trump to change any of her problems, but she's going to stick with him because at least he heard her. At least he's saying things that she would like to say. That's, in my opinion, not a very enlightened reaction. But man boasts that he could shoot people on Fifth Avenue and he'll still stick with them. Unbelievable. But that said, both parties really need to start addressing some of these grievances. They are legitimate issues. We have to relook at the Dodd-Frank bill. We have to outlaw certain practices that are going on. And right now, Trump wants to clean the swamp. There are more lobbyists in Washington than ever. They're all trying to fight for their benefit. And I'm glad he's doing some work in Asia, but he's been absent as a negotiator. Doesn't care what's passed. Well, a president doesn't care what's passed as long as he can put something on the board. Again, it takes care of the immediate problem that he's being attacked now for no record. He doesn't think of, well, what will happen when I have the record and the record's miserable? And then they ask us questions. Like, well, all right, so I picked two people out of a line, made them my foreign policy advisors. Yes, that's the cat over here. Sir, hi.
Hi, just great talk.
Who are you, sir?
Jordan.
Hello. Hi.
Recent graduate of IU. To
Good.
follow on Bob's question.
Yes, sir.
So, I wanted to just ask what Buckley's response is to this question of the madness of crowds, because even though we're talking about how there might be legitimate grievances, and I think that that's likely true, there was still significant primary support for Donald Trump.
Yep.
And there's this complicating issue of the lack of voter turnout just generally.
Yep.
So the electorate is small in that sense, and people have given up their duties as citizens of the republic. So the madness of crowds in that sense being not just support for Donald Trump, but a general disaffect for...
Well, I'll tell you what would have bothered him. By the way, I feel uncomfortable again saying what the dead would say, because he's not here. I can only quote what I know. And by the way, I'm not here as Buckley's press secretary. I'm
You can
here
say
as
what you think.
No, I will. I'll say what I think. But I tell interviewers I'm not here as his press secretary. I criticize him a lot. In certain areas, I trash him a lot. I really believe by bringing down the underbrush, some of his virtues will shine even greater. But I'm not uncritical of him. This is not hagiography. And I'm particularly very critical about him in the early years of the Civil Rights Movement. I think he read the Eisenhower administration completely wrong, even though that was the beginning of conservatism. He thought I wasn't conservatism enough. I respectfully disagreed. But, all right, back to your question. What I think would have scared him was, it's not just that these people are voting for him. Reagan's best speech was at the 92 Republican Republican National Convention, his last speech, where he followed Pat Buchanan, right, and being no dope and beginning to start showing signs of his disease, says to the American people, I always appeal to your finest hopes, not your worst fears. This is Ronald Reagan talking to the Reagan constituents, the Reagan Democrats. I appeal to your finest hopes, not your worst fears. I tried to bring you to a better place. I want you to think of me as you pick that torch up. I mean, he knew that was his last speech in a lot of ways in public. Buckley would have been very appalled at the bullying at these rallies, at the singling out journalists. Throw your chairs out there, right? George Wallace used to pull this. He came to my college, and there were some demonstrators. There were always demonstrators at a college. There were demonstrators in faculty half the time, but nevertheless. And Wallace says, they sit down in front of my car, I'm going to tell my driver to step on the gas. Right. Real humane, bring us together, problem solver, that man. He wasn't appealing for student votes, he was appealing for people on television who saw him say that. So when he started saying, those press over here, right, they hate this country, right? A guy demonstrates, and carry the son of a bitch out, right? All that is rebel rousing. That is not leadership. That is not getting to a better place. It's certainly not appealing to a fondest hopes. You have a comment?
We have about 5 minutes
all
to go, so unless there's some burning question here, I'm going to put to our speaker, at the risk of opening up a whole new line of inquiry, this comment I would have made. As I read the book and actually experienced this, what's interesting is the degree to which Buckley, fellow travelers like Irving Kristol and others, relied heavily for the intellectual firepower on universities. I mean, you talk a lot about the influence of Wilmore Kendall, Yale professor, on Buckley. And you go down the list. Also, as a recovered, maybe still recovering think tank president, the notion that think tanks, even the one I used to head, would sway with the political currents, including and financial currents, doesn't, alas, surprise me, having lived in that world as long as I did. It's always great when a think tank, will take a stand for principle and tell a donor to get lost, but it doesn't happen too often. I once tried to raise funds from the Washington rep of Lockheed, and he told me he's a very nice man, a former moon astronaut. A moon astronaut landed on the moon. He said to me, well, Les, Hudson Institute's located where? Indianapolis. We're not going to support you. When we support think tanks, we are buying access. At least he was honest. I mean, the ones that said we may support you, always gave the nightmare. So I'm not surprised with the way the think tank world's going. But what interests me, the question is, to what extent, and I'm deliberately posing it this way because we are all university people here, to what extent have changes in the university, I'm not going to specify which ones because I think there's several, contribute to what we see as this kind of hollowing out of an intellectual politics, not only on the conservative side, but arguably on the liberal side as well.
Is that for me?
Yeah, that's the question. And, and as I say, I mean, you can dispute the premise.
No, I don't dispute it.
That, the Buckley movement, and you made this point about not resolving the elitist populism. Nonetheless, the pages of National Review, his own efforts really rely heavily on things that were going on in universities.
Absolutely. Look, he could have written a populist magazine. He could have gone for the lowest common denominator. He wanted students to read through the dictionary. Right? President Hoover said, "How can I help you?" And he said, "I certainly want your money, but what I really want more than your money is a gift subscriptions for students to get the magazine." And so President Hoover, early 1950s or so, mid-50s till the day he died, every Christmas time there'd be like 100 or more subscriptions from the ex-president of the United States to, I don't know how many students at the University of Indiana. He said, "I want my magazine to be in the mailbox." He would say something like, maybe there are about 10,000 opinion leaders in the country. Maybe there are more. Maybe they're clergy, they're professors, they're politicians, they're lay people who are active in the Kiwanis, the Rotary, whatever it is. I want my magazine to be in their mailbox, just when they get the New Republic and Saturday Review and Atlantic and all the others. I want to be in their consciousness. I don't care if they convert. I'd like them to convert. But I want them to know we're there. I want to engage with them. They had a very active arts and letters and review section in the back of National Review. Your premise is right. Now, what worries me, because you can't speak for this now, I think to some extent universities, either consciously or unconsciously, like the media's case very consciously, I think, but they've chose to become the opposition, the partisan opposition. I could probably give you 200 names of the top people in the Obama administration who are now holding major positions at universities without PhD, without the professional training that any of us had. And I see them every night on MSNBC or you name it. There's supposedly a fellow at the XYZ, whatever it is, and they're on with Rachel Maddow all day long. If not Rachel Maddow, but Andrea Mitchell or somebody else. And I think it's a very dangerous thing. Now, it's happened in the past, certainly. We've had future presidents come out of universities. We've had ex-presidents teach universities. All this great stuff. We've had presidential libraries spring up on university campus, yes. But I've never seen this kind of exodus from Pennsylvania Avenue and various places to universities that are tax exempt. Law firms are not, I point out, and carrying on their cause. They could be Obama spokesmen coming in from a law firm and coming in from a corporation, although corporations probably would be less free with their time. There's not academic freedom of corporations, some other corporations, okay? And the media, too. Now, look, the media doesn't have to be pro-Trump. The media could do the public a tremendous service. God knows they've got 24 hours of nothing. They don't have to have the same show, right, with the same panels, with a changing of the anchor every GD hour, right? They could actually say, we're having a debate on the tax plank that worries Les Lankowski about taxing university endowments. They could do that. And they could say why the Trump plan is wrong or why the Kevin Brady plan is wrong. And they could do that. They could actually talk about the history of Korea. Or when Trump got into a spitting match with Senator Corker. This is what people hate about politics. And what I hate about politics. Because they don't like Trump, that any criticism made of Trump is true, and everything Trump says is wrong because he says it. Witness Corker. Corker criticizes Trump. Trump's response is, weren't for him, we wouldn't have the Iran agreement. Well, Corker says, I voted against the agreement. Well, yes, that did not nullify what the president said. Right? They had 2 weeks, more than that. It's a year of negotiations. What are they going to do with this? And the Senate had the option of saying it's a treaty or we're going to court. Obama tried to sell that agreement with citing 4 precedents. Maybe we should support the agreement, but let's just talk about the facts here. They cited the Kennedy test ban. They cited the INF Treaty, they cited SALT I. All were treaties, all came to the Senate, 2/3 vote. Suddenly it's not a treaty. And they're going to treat it as an agreement. And suddenly, instead of the Senate voting 2/3 to pass it, the hourglass gets flipped, and it will be considered extra, I call this extra constitutional, not constitutional, not contested. And so Corker runs the Foreign Affairs Committee, and McConnell has the option to take it to the courts. They did on recess appointments. When they stand up for their power, they win. And the court said, excuse us, the Senate decides for this in recess, not the president. You can't make an appointment. Well, so, no, Corker could vote no. Well, that's great. Tell your base you voted no. But his acquiescence is what brought the agreement to the Congress. So Trump was right on that one. But they hate him so much. Now, if you don't want to do it the way I just did it, then let's give us 10 minutes on the history of this Iran agreement. Let's talk about a treaty. Well, they're afraid of using viewers. Much easier to throw pies at them and makes him out, puff himself up, and makes Corker into Downy Webster out of nowhere. And all right, I'm just
calling him Little Bob at the same time.
Yeah. That's my point. So, Master Universities. Yeah. I
To
agree.
continue that, please join me in thanking Paul for very stimulating presentation, and especially those of you whose appetites have been whetted. I think we have 3 signed copies of the book.
I'll write you.
Rush over and get them. Our next presentation, if I may.
Thank you for hosting me.
Is a political theorist named Jason Brennan, who has written a very provocative critique of democracy. And I believe our date here is going to be, it's either November 30th or December 1, whichever is the Friday.